All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering today is how to achieve anything by ignoring reality. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be discussing more specifically is first the overview itself, the backwards equation, seeing the equation, flipping the variables, holding the inversion through the lag, the review, and then your action items for the day or the next few days. Now, if you want this document along with this training, make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. If you want to work with me one-on-one, make sure to book a call, again, from the link in the description. And if you want weekly newsletters on improving in every aspect of your life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, then make sure to join the newsletter, again, from the link in the description. With that said and out of the way, let's get started and talk about the backwards equation. So what I want to walk you through today is something that genuinely changed how I think about pretty much everything. And it starts with a really simple observation that there is an equation underneath our lives, underneath our money, our health, our relationships, all of it. And the thing is, most of us have read it backwards for as long as we can remember, which means every decision you've made and every pattern you've fallen into has been built on a sequence that was inverted from the start. And once you see that, once you really get it, and I believe you will after this training, a lot of things that never made really a lot of sense before suddenly click into place. So here's how the equation runs for most people. And this probably describes your default mode as well. And it describes almost everyone's. And the way it plays out is really something happens in your external world, in your reality. Your mind then immediately generates a thought about it. That thought produces a feeling. You act from that feeling, and then those actions produce more of the same kind of reality, which triggers the same thoughts and the same feelings again. And so the whole thing just loops over and over and over again without you ever noticing that you're the one keeping it going. And the reason it's so hard to catch is that the whole sequence really happens on autopilot. Like you wake up, you check your phone, maybe you see something that stresses you out, and then a thought fires before you're even really conscious of it. And it can be anything. It can be, this isn't good, or I'm falling behind. And then that thought instantly produces a response in your body, a feeling. It could be a tightness in your chest. It could be a low hum of anxiety that just sits there for the rest of the day. And from that place, you then start making decisions. You start interacting with people and reality and make choices. And you carry that energy into everything, essentially, which is how you end up at the end of most days feeling like nothing has really changed. You spent the entire day reacting to circumstances that were already old, already finished, already the output of a previous cycle, and then you use those old outputs as the raw material for your next round of thinking and feeling. So of course, the result looks the same. And the really tricky part is that none of this really feels like a choice. It feels like just how life works, which is exactly why most people never really question it. And it keeps running the same in the background, the same loop for years or even decades without people really realizing there's another way to operate. And the thing is, the whole sequence feels so obvious and so natural that nobody ever stops to question it. Of course, you think negative thoughts when bad things happen, right? Of course, those thoughts make you feel a certain way. And then, of course, you react from that place. You're just reacting to the world, right? Of course. That's just being a reasonable person, right? But that right there is the trap. What you're actually doing when you run that sequence is really letting the output of your life dictate the input. And when you do that, you're locked into producing the same result every time. So it's sort of like being stuck in a feedback loop where the answer keeps feeding back into the question, and the question keeps producing the same answer. And on it goes. And you just go around and around wondering why your life feels like it's on repeat when the mechanism causing the repetition is something you're doing every single day without awareness. And every time you let your circumstances trigger the same automatic thoughts, which produce the same feelings, which drive the same reactions, you're basically telling your system, yes, this is real, this is important, keep building more of this, which means your reactions are reinforcing the very reality you're trying to change. And that's why willpower alone can't really break the cycle. The cycle is running at a deeper level than willpower can actually reach. So whatever you're looking at right now in your life, maybe it's your bank account, maybe it's your body, maybe it's your relationships, all of that is basically a printout, right? Just like the image shows. And I mean that in a very literal sense, is the result of an equation that was already solved weeks or months or even years ago by the thoughts you were thinking and the feelings you were carrying at that time. Which means the reality you're experiencing today is old data. It's already finished, and it has nothing to do with what's actually possible for you going forward. So think of your current circumstances as a kind of energetic history, a record of where your internal state was at some earlier point. And the reason that matters is that most people look at that record and they treat it like it's a live feed. They think this is what's happening right now, when really it's more like reading last month's report and mistaking it for today's one. So basically, there is a delay between when you change internally and when that change shows up externally. And it's a built-in feature of how all of this works. So if you're judging your progress by what you can see in front of you right now, you're always going to be looking at evidence from an older version of yourself, which is genuinely misleading if you don't understand the mechanics. So the stuff that's showing up in your life today is residual, is the echo of a previous internal state, is the echo of a cause that was a long time ago. And the sooner you really internalize that, the sooner you stop giving it so much weight, because you realize you're reading the receipt from a transaction that has already happened, and that receipt tells you nothing about what the next transaction is going to look like, the better. So this is actually a really freeing thing once you really understand it. It means your current reality isn't a verdict. It isn't some final judgment on who you are or what you're capable of. And I know most of you probably know this to a degree. It's just the tail end of an older process. You know that your future is probably brighter than your current reality, but you most likely don't know that the current reality is just a result of what happened maybe years ago. It's just as I said, the tail end of an older process, and the equation that produced it has already been solved, which means you're free to write a completely new one starting right now. And what comes out the other side of that new equation will most likely look nothing like what you're seeing today, which is honestly one of the most liberating realizations you can have. It takes the pressure off of your current situation entirely, and you stop fighting what's in front of you, and you stop trying to fix the printout, and instead you put all of your energy into writing better inputs, which is the only thing that actually moves the needle. And that shift from fixing the output to changing the input is basically the whole game. It's what separates people who stay stuck in the same patterns from people who seem to create change almost effortlessly. So the second group figured out that you don't change your life by wrestling with reality. You change it by changing what goes into the equation first. So the default equation, the one that almost everyone is running unconsciously, runs in a loop of circumstances create thoughts, those thoughts create feelings, those feelings create some actions, and then those lead to the same circumstances. And that's a closed loop. There's no exit point. You just keep cycling through the same sequence over and over and over again. And the reason it feels so inescapable is that at every point in the chain, the next step feels like the only logical response to the one before it. So it never occurs to you that the whole chain could be reversed, right? And what makes this especially hard to see is that the default equation feels like reality itself. It feels like this is just how cause and effect works. Most people never really question it. They just assume that the outside world causes their thoughts and feelings, and that's that. And then they spend their whole lives trying to rearrange the external circumstances, hoping it will make them feel different, which sometimes works temporarily, but never really lasts because the underlying equation hasn't changed. And a big part of why this is so ingrained is that you are conditioned into it from a very young age. Your parents and your teachers and culture all modeled the default equation for you. They taught you implicitly, mostly, that your thoughts and feelings are caused by what happens to you, which set up the whole pattern before you were old enough to even question it. So by the time you're an adult, running the default equation feels natural. It's as natural as breathing. You don't even register it as a pattern, let alone a pattern that you could actually change, which is why the first step in breaking out of it is simply becoming aware that it actually exists. You can't invert something you haven't even noticed. And what I'm telling you is that this whole chain is running in the wrong direction. The actual order is the reverse of what you've been taught. And the moment you understand that, the moment you really get that thoughts and feelings come first, and reality follows, and that you ignore reality and just create thoughts and feelings, everything starts to make a different kind of sense, and you start to see why some people seem to create results almost magnetically, while others grind away for years and barely move the needle. So the inverted equation, the one that actually produces change, flips the order to thoughts, create feelings, create actions, which create new circumstances. And the key difference is that in this version, you're absolutely ignoring reality. You're the one choosing the starting point instead of letting your environment choose it for you, which puts you back in control of the whole chain. And that's what this whole training is really about. It's about learning to run the equation in the right direction. And the 3 steps I'm going to walk you through are the practical tools for actually doing it in your daily life, starting with the most fundamental one, which is simply learning to see the equation in the first place. Now, the reason most people's lives feel like they're on repeat, like the same problems keep cycling back around no matter what they do, is because they keep looking at the old printout and using it as the input for the next round of thinking and feeling, which just produces another version of the same printout. And then they look at that one and they react to it again and do the whole thing over and over and over again. And you can run that loop for decades, honestly, without ever realizing that you're the one sustaining it. And it's worth pointing out that this applies to everything, not just money or career stuff. It shows up in your relationships where you keep attracting the same kind of person or the same kind of dynamic. It shows up in health where you keep falling back into the same patterns no matter how many diets or programs you try. And it shows up in your general mood and energy because all of those things are outputs of the same underlying equation. So if you've ever had that feeling of, here we go again, that sense that you're basically dealing with the same issue in a slightly different costume, that's the default equation doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is produce consistent results based on a consistent input, and the input hasn't changed because you've been letting the output write it. And once you see this pattern in one area of your life, you'll be able to start seeing it everywhere because it really is universal. It's the same mechanism playing out across every domain, which is both a little overwhelming at first, but also incredibly empowering. There's one thing to fix, one equation to invert, and that inversion ripples out across everything else. And I want to be clear, this isn't about blaming yourself, right? When you understand that you've been running the equation backwards, yes, the natural response might be a little bit of frustration or guilt, but that's the old equation trying to reassert itself. The much more useful response is to just go, okay, now I see it and now I can change it. Almost as if you just finally got the answer to a mathematical equation, to a math problem, which is exactly what we're going to do in the next section. And it's really that mechanical. It's just a sequence that can be run in one direction or another. And most people happen to be running it in the direction that keeps them stuck. And once you learn to run it in the other direction, the results change. And they change in ways that feel almost surprising at first because you're so used to the old output. And that's honestly the thing I want you to walk away with from this section, that the reason your life maybe looks a certain way, or the way it does look right now, is completely understandable. It's completely explainable and completely changeable because it's all just the output of an equation, and equations can be rewritten. So with that said, let's cover seeing the equation. So before you can actually flip anything around, you have to actually see what's happening. The default equation runs so automatically, so far below the surface of your conscious awareness, that most people go through their entire day reacting to reality without once catching themselves in the act. And that automatic quality is exactly what gives it so much power, since you can't really change a process you haven't even identified yet. And what I mean by seeing the equation is honestly pretty straightforward. It's just starting to pay attention to the specific moments in your day where your external circumstances are dictating how you think and how that thinking is shaping how you feel, and then recognizing that in those moments, you're running the old sequence. You're letting the printout write the next equation. You're basically feeding the answer back into the formula, which is exactly the mechanism that keeps the loop locked into place. So for example, let's say you check your bank balance and it's lower than you want. A thought fires instantly, most likely something like, I'm not where I should be, or I spent too much last weekend. And that thought drops something in your body, right? That heaviness, that tightness. And the whole thing happens in half a second, completely on autopilot, without you making any conscious choice about it. And from that lowered state, you go about your day carrying that weight into every conversation and every decision you make. And the speed of it is part of what makes it so invisible. Because by the time you're aware of the thought that fired, let alone the feeling it created, you've already reacted. The equation has already run, and now you're living inside the output of that reaction, making it feel like the emotional state is just the truth, when really it was generated by a mechanical process you didn't even notice. And this happens dozens of times a day, honestly, not just with money, but with everything. Someone says something dismissive, and maybe your mind interprets it in a certain way that shifts your mood. Or you see someone on social media doing better than you, and a thought fires that contracts something inside. Or maybe you hit a setback in your work, and the story your mind tells about it drops your whole energy. And each one of those moments is basically an instance of the default equation firing. And each one reinforces the loop that keeps your reality looking the same. And the thing about these micro reactions is that they accumulate. So even if no single one of them seems like a big deal, by the end of the day, you basically run the default equation 50 or 100 times without catching it. And all of those reactions have collectively set the emotional tone that's going to shape what shows up next in your life. Which is why awareness alone, or just the act of starting to notice, is so much more powerful than it sounds on the surface, because every time you catch the thought mid-flight, you're interrupting a compounding process. You're pulling back one brick out of the wall that the default equation is trying to build. And over time, those interruptions add up to a fundamentally different internal landscape, right? Now, here's a useful way to really think about your recurring problems. They're kind of like background apps running on your phone. They're just sitting there quietly, they consume energy, and every time you open one of them, every time you give it your attention and your emotional investment, you're telling the system, keep this one active, this one really matters. And it stays in the loop, which is why some issues seem to follow you around for years, even when you think you've dealt with them. And you only have so much emotional bandwidth in a given day. And if half of it is going to background processes that are just recycling old patterns, then you have that much less available for actually creating something new, which is why people often feel exhausted even when they haven't really done anything. Their internal system was busy running old equations all day long. So one of the most powerful moves you can actually make, and this sounds almost too simple, is to just stop opening the app, meaning stop engaging with the old pattern when it pops up. Let it sit there without clicking on it, and eventually it times out on its own. These patterns can only sustain themselves when you keep feeding them your attention and your emotional energy. And this is really the same principle we talked about earlier with the printout, the idea that your current reality is sustained by ongoing input. So when you withdraw the input, which is in practical terms means withdrawing your emotional reactivity, the pattern starts to lose its hold, it starts to fade because there's nothing feeding it anymore. And what you're really learning to do here is really become more selective about what gets your cognitive and emotional energy, because right now most people are just broadcasting their energy at whatever's loudest in their environment, or whatever's most urgent or most stressful or most in their face, and that's how the default equation stays in control. So the shift is really learning how to consciously choose where your energy goes instead of letting circumstances make that choice for you. And this doesn't mean suppressing your feelings or pretending things don't bother you. That's a different thing entirely, right? What it means is developing the ability to notice a thought rising and then choosing whether to invest in it or let it pass, which is a skill. It takes practice. And it gets easier the more you do it. And honestly, this is probably the most underrated skill in personal development, I think. Everyone wants the advanced techniques and the big breakthroughs, but the ability to simply notice your own thinking in real time and choose differently is the foundation that everything else is built on. Because without it, none of the other steps really work. You have to do that in one way or another in order to create change. So the practical move here, and this is something you can start doing literally today, is what I call the equation check. And all it takes is a few times a day, you just pause for a second and ask yourself, am I reacting to my reality right now, or am I creating it? That's it, that one question. Because the moment you catch the thought that's driving your reaction, you've already stepped outside the loop for just a second, and that second of awareness is where the inversion becomes possible. Now, the pause itself is the thing, really. In the default equation, there is no pause. The thought fires, the feeling follows, the action happens. There's nothing in between. So when you insert even a tiny gap between what happens and how you react and how you think, you fundamentally change the mechanics of the process. You've created a space where choice can exist, and that space is where all of the real work happens. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is your freedom and your power to choose. And that's essentially what the equation check is designed to give you. It's a tool for creating that space reliably multiple times a day so that you're not just hoping for moments of awareness, but actively generating them. And consistency matters here more than intensity, as with a lot of things in life, meaning it's much better to do 3 or 4 brief equation checks spread throughout your day than to do one big meditation in the morning and then run on autopilot for the next 16 hours. Because the default equation fires all day long. So your awareness practice needs to be distributed across the day too. And every time you do this, every time you catch the automatic thought in the middle of firing and then you pause, you're essentially weakening the automaticity of the default equation just a little bit. And over days and weeks, those small disruptions accumulate into something really significant because the loop that's been running your life can only maintain itself really through uninterrupted repetition. Each interruption is chipping away at its foundation. And the results are cumulative in a way that's easy to underestimate at first, because on any given day, the equation check might feel small and unremarkable, but if you do it consistently for a few weeks, you'll start to notice that your baseline emotional state has shifted, that you're less reactive generally, that things that used to hook you just don't land the same way, and that's the default equation losing its grip. And this is really the foundational practice for everything that comes next, because without this ability to see the equation and interrupt it, the other 2 steps won't stick. You'll try to invert things, but the default pattern will keep pulling you back. So treat this step as the ground floor and give it the attention it really deserves. And look, I want to be honest with you about why this is difficult, and it should be. Your nervous system is literally built to read reality first and then respond second. It's a survival mechanism, and it has kept humans alive for hundreds of thousands of years, and you're asking it to operate in a way that feels fundamentally counterintuitive, which is why it takes real practice and patience and a willingness to be bad at it for a while before it starts to become more natural. Because survival mode and creation mode, I believe, are genuinely 2 different ways of being. And your body defaults to survival because that's what kept your ancestors alive. So when you start trying to override that default, there's going to be resistance, there's going to be discomfort, and your system is most likely going to protest because it thinks you're doing something dangerous, right? Even though you're actually just doing something that will change your life. And the wiring of this goes deep. It isn't some minor habit that you can just decide to stop. It's a neurological pattern that's been reinforced by every experience you've ever had, and you're not going to catch every reaction right away, and that's completely fine for the perfectionists out there. The goal is to just catch more of them over time on average, and the trend matters infinitely more than any single instance. So be patient with the process and trust that even catching yourself 1 or 2 extra times a day or a week is meaningful progress, because each catch is a small proof of concept, and it shows that the default equation can be actually interrupted, and that you're not completely at the mercy of your reactions, and that alone will start to shift something fundamental in how you relate to your own experience. So really, what you're doing with this whole first step is building the capacity to override a system that's been running unchecked your entire life, which is a big deal if you think about it. And it's worth acknowledging that rather than rushing through it, because the people who take this step seriously and really practice it are the ones who make the other 2 steps work better. The people who skip it or treat it as obvious are the ones who end up back in the same loop 6 months later, wondering what happened. So think of this as the foundation, the thing that everything else really rests on, and give it the weight it deserves in your daily practice, because if you can consistently see the equation firing in real time, you've already done something that most people never manage to do. And from that place of awareness, the inversion becomes genuinely possible. And once you've built this awareness muscle up to the point where you're catching yourself regularly throughout the day, where the equation check has become almost second nature, that's when you're ready for the second step, which is where things really start to get interesting, because now you're going to take that awareness and use it to actually flip the variables around. So let's talk about flipping the variables. Now, once you see the equation running, the next move is to really invert it. And this is where the whole thing starts to get really interesting, because what you're doing here is deliberately choosing the thoughts and generating the feelings of the reality you want before any evidence of it shows up in your life. And honestly, this is the step that most people either skip entirely or do halfway. And it's one that matters the most, because this is where the actual direction of the equation really changes. So here's what I mean in practical terms. In the default equation, you wait for something good to happen, your mind thinks a thought about it, and then you feel good about it. That's the normal order that everyone's used to. Or something bad happens, your mind thinks a thought about it, and then you feel bad about it. That's just the normal order that everyone's used to. But in the inverted equation, you choose the thought first, which generates the feeling. You create the internal state deliberately and on purpose, and then you let reality reorganize around that. So you're writing the input side of the equation by hand instead of letting your circumstances fill it in for you, which completely changes what comes out on the other end. Now, the key word here is first, because the timing is everything, right? You're not thinking empowering thoughts and feeling good in response to something good that happened. You're generating them before anything has changed, which can feel counterintuitive and even a little crazy at first, but that's exactly the inversion. That's the whole point. You're reversing the direction of cause and effect in your own experience. And it has to be deliberate. It has to be something you do on purpose with intention, because your default system is always going to want to read reality first and then respond second, which is why this step requires active practice. Often, you can't just hope your thoughts and feelings will change on their own. You have to actually choose them, which is a very different thing. So you can see the image of the default equation and the inverted equation. And there's a real reason this works, by the way. It's grounded in something your nervous system actually does. Your brain, at a neurological level, genuinely cannot tell the difference between a vividly felt internal experience and the one that's actually happening in the external world. So if you really sit with the thoughts and feelings of financial security, for example, if you let your body relax into how you would think at that point and what that would feel like in your chest and your shoulders and your breathing, then your nervous system responds to that signal the same way it would respond to a real event. Because your biology doesn't fact check the source. It just processes whatever data it receives. And there's a substantial body of research on this in neuroscience. The basic finding being that mental rehearsal activates many of the same neural pathways as actual experience, which is why athletes use visualization so effectively. And it's the same mechanism at work here. Except instead of rehearsing a physical performance, you're rehearsing a cognitive and emotional state. So when you sit in the morning and genuinely feel into the state of the person who already has what you want, your biology is responding to that as if it's real. Your hormones most likely will shift, your nervous system will calibrate to that frequency, and your whole physiology will start to align with a different reality. And that physiological shift is what changes the input of the equation at the most fundamental level. Now, the beautiful thing about this is that your body doesn't argue with it. It doesn't say, well, actually, you don't have that yet, so I'm not going to respond. It just processes the signal, which means you have the ability to manually set your internal state regardless of what's happening outside of you. And that's the inversion in action. So the morning practice I'd recommend, and this is something I do myself, is spending about 5 minutes before you do anything else, before you check your phone, before you let the world in, just sitting with a version of you who already has what you want. And I want to be specific about what I mean, because it isn't visualization the way most people think of it. You're not trying to picture a mansion or a car or a perfect body here. You're thinking and feeling into a state, the internal experience of being the person who already lives that reality. What I mean by that is the particular combination of thoughts and feelings that would be present if your desired reality was already your current one. So for some people, that's a deep calm and a sense of certainty. For others, it can be just a warm confidence. For others, it's a quiet gratitude mixed with excitement. The exact flavor will be different for everyone, but the key is that it's a felt experience in your body, not a picture in your mind or a sentence that you repeat like an affirmation. It's a felt experience. So you're really looking for a whole body experience here, because that level of embodiment is what makes the signal strong enough for your nervous system to respond to it, and it helps to get really specific with yourself about what the thoughts and feelings actually are. And 5 minutes is genuinely enough. You don't need to sit for an hour doing this. What matters is the quality of the thoughts and the feelings and how fully you let yourself drop into them. And if you do it consistently every morning, it becomes the state that you carry into the rest of your day, which means you're really running the inverted equation from the very start of your day. And consistency is the thing that makes this work long term, because obviously a single session feels nice, but doesn't really change much. Whereas doing it every day for weeks starts to fundamentally shift your baseline state. So you can think of it as a compounding investment. Each session adds a little bit to the total, and over time, those small deposits add up to a completely different internal state, which is going to produce obviously a completely different set of outputs in your external reality. Now, the compounding effect is why people who stick with this for a few months often describe the results as feeling almost sudden, even though the process was very gradual. And the reason this matters so much, the reason I'm spending this much time on it, is because the thought and the feeling it produces are the actual variables that determine the output of the equation. Everything else, the money, the relationship, the health, the opportunities, those are all downstream of an internal state that was held consistently enough and long enough for reality to reorganize around it. Now, most people are focused entirely on the external things they want. The amount in the bank, maybe the relationship, the body, and they're trying to create those things directly through effort and strategy, which sometimes works but doesn't really last, because the underlying input, your thoughts, feelings, and who you believe you are, haven't really changed. So the stuff is always downstream. It's always the effect. And the thoughts and the feelings are always the cause. And when you really get that, when it stops being a concept and becomes something you actually live by, then you stop chasing outcomes and you start managing your thinking and your internal state, which is the only lever that actually controls the output of the equation in a lasting way, and the only part that you can actually fully control. So when you sit down in the morning and do this practice, you're essentially giving reality a new set of instructions to solve for. You're plugging a different value into the input side of the equation, and over time, as you hold that value more and more consistently, the output has to change because the input changed. And that's genuinely just how equations work, right? There's no version of this where you change one side and the other stays the same indefinitely. And that inevitability is something important, and you need to be able to trust, because during the process, it can really feel uncertain. It can feel like nothing's happening, but the math is the math. If the input is different, then the output will eventually be different as well. And holding on to that understanding is what gets you through the difficult middle part. Once you've started flipping the variables, once you're regularly generating your internal state before your external world gives you a reason to, you're going to run into something that trips up almost everyone. And that's the lag between when the input changes and when the output catches up. So let's talk about holding the inversion through the lag. So this is the part where most people fall off. And honestly, it's the most important part to really understand, because when you start running the inverted equation, when you genuinely shift your thinking and your internal state and start thinking and feeling differently on the inside, your external reality doesn't update right away. There's a delay, a gap. And that gap is where almost everyone gives up and really flips back to the default equation. And they interpret the delay as proof that the inversion didn't work. Now, the lag makes sense if you think about the momentum involved. You might have spent 5, 10, 20 years running the old equation in one direction, building up all this momentum through repetition, thinking certain thoughts, feeling certain feelings, acting from those patterns over and over again. And that momentum doesn't just stop the moment you decide to change. It can take some time to slow down and then reverse direction, which is completely normal and completely expected. It's logical as well. The old output you're seeing right now is the result of all that accumulated momentum, and it's still being delivered to you because it was already in the pipeline. It was already queued up, already on its way, and nothing you do today can really recall it or speed up the transition. All you can do is keep putting new inputs into the equation and then wait for the new outputs to start arriving as well. And this is where patience becomes genuinely important. The lag can last days or weeks or sometimes longer. It can last years or months, depending on how much momentum the old equation really had. And during that time, you're essentially living in two realities at once. Your internal state says one thing and your external world says another. And that tension is uncomfortable. I get it completely, but it's also the clear sign that the inversion is working. And ask every successful person, they will tell you that this is the most important part of holding your thinking, holding your mindset in the right place, holding your thinking and feelings in the right place in your internal state. It's during that lag. Now, during the lag, the old reality is going to scream louder than it ever has because bills are still going to come, right? There's still going to be people acting in the same way with you. There's still going to be setbacks that happen. And all of it is going to feel like evidence that nothing has really changed. But what's actually happening is that the old equation is finishing its print run. Those last pages from the previous job are still coming through the printer. And the worst thing you can do is look at those old pages and then conclude that your new equation didn't go through, because it did. It's just waiting in line. So the old outputs that show up during the lag aren't new problems. They're old ones that were already in transit. They were created by the previous input and they're being delivered on schedule. You should have just expected them. And the fact that they're still arriving doesn't mean anything about what's coming next. That's even more important to realize. It just means that the delivery system has a built-in delay. The same way as when you order from Amazon or whatever, right? You pay, and for a moment there, you have paid the money, it has exited your bank account, and you still haven't received the thing that you've ordered from Amazon. It's that delay. And this is genuinely the most misleading part of the whole process, because your logical mind is going to look at the evidence and construct a very convincing argument that nothing has changed and nothing is going to change. And that argument is going to feel reasonable and rational and most likely, quote unquote, realistic. But it's based entirely on old data, which makes it irrelevant to what's actually being created on the input side of the equation. And I won't sugarcoat it, this part feels like a test. It feels like the universe, God, life, your mind, whatever you want to call it, is checking whether you really mean it or whether you're going to fold at the first sign of resistance. And while I don't really think of it as a cosmic test exactly, the functional reality is the same. The lag is where your commitment to the inverted equation either holds or breaks. And that commitment is the only thing that really determines the outcome. Now, this, by the way, is what separates people who actually transform their lives from people who just keep cycling through these same old patterns. Because the information is really out there, right? Everyone has access to these ideas now, but the people who break through are the ones who can hold the new input even when the old output is still showing up everywhere around them. That capacity to actually hold is the real skill. It's the thing that can be taught, that can't be taught through concepts alone. It has to be built through practice. And holding here means that when the old reality pushes back, when the lag delivers another piece of evidence from the old equation, from your old life, from your old way of thinking and feeling, you don't take the bait. You don't let it reset your thinking and your internal state back to the default. You just acknowledge what's happening. You feel whatever you feel for a moment, and then you consciously return to the chosen thoughts and emotional signature you set in step 2, because that's the input that matters. And every time you return to it after a disruption, you're actually strengthening the inverted equation rather than weakening it. So each return to your chosen state after a disruption is actually making the inversion stronger, because you're not just maintaining the new input. You're proving to your nervous system that this state can survive contact with contradictory evidence, which builds the resilience that makes each subsequent disruption easier to handle. So the lag period, as uncomfortable as it is actually the part of the process where the most growth happens, because it's where you build the capacity to hold an internal state independently of external circumstances. And that capacity is the whole game, right? Once you have it, the inversion becomes self-sustaining and the external changes follow naturally. And this is this capacity, the skill of being able to control your thoughts and control your feelings is really one of the most underrated, I think, skills to success, really, in any field, not just financial success. And I want to stress again that this is pretty mechanical. It's just the way the system works. There's a delay between cause and effect. The old outputs need time to clear, and your job is during that time is simply to not flip the equation back to default. That's it. You don't need to do anything else. You just need to hold your position and keep feeding the new input into the equation. And the more systematically you approach this, the easier it gets. Meaning, if you have a clear morning practice, like we talked about in step 2, and you have the equation check running a few times throughout the day from step 1, you've basically built a system that supports the inversion automatically. So you're not really relying on willpower anymore. You have actual practices in place that keep the new input flowing even on difficult days. And that's why the 3 steps work together as a system rather than as an isolated technique. Because step 1 gives you the awareness to cache the default equation. Step 2 gives you the practice for setting the new input. And then step 3 is really about maintaining that new input through the period where the old output is still visible. And each step supports the other 2. So the practical technique for really getting through the lag is what I call the lag reframe. And it goes like this. Whenever old reality pushes back, whenever something shows up that looks like proof that nothing is really changing, you recognize it for what it is, old output, already finished, already irrelevant to what you're actually building right now. And then instead of engaging with it, you bring your attention back to the internal state you set in step 2. You reconnect with that feeling, to the thoughts, you hold it, and you let the old output pass through without giving it any more of your energy. Now, the reason this works as a technique is because it gives your mind something specific to do in the moment of disruption. Instead of just trying to not react, which is vague and hard to execute, you're giving yourself a concrete reframe that puts the old output in context. And that context immediately takes the emotional charge out of it. You're no longer interpreting it as current evidence. You're interpreting it as old data that's just being cleared away. So the reframe can be almost immediate once you practice it a few times, to the point where you see an old pattern showing up and your first thought is just old stuff, and you just move on. So it's simple enough to remember and use even when you're stressed, which is exactly when you need it most. So keep it in your back pocket and use it every time the lag tries to pull you back into the old equation. Now, after you use the reframe, the redirect back to your chosen thoughts and emotional state is really the critical second step, because the reframe alone will, of course, just neutralize that old trigger, but it doesn't generate any new input. So you need to actively bring your attention back to the thoughts and the feelings from your morning practice, even just for 10 or 15 seconds. It doesn't need to be a long process in the moment, just a quick reconnection. Just a brief dropping in to those thoughts and feelings of certainty or calm or whatever your cognitive and emotional signature was, just enough to reestablish the signal. And each time you do this, each time you reframe and redirect, you're stacking another data point in favor of the new equation. And those data points accumulate into a new normal, a new baseline, and eventually the lag just ends, right? And the new output starts showing up in your life. So the question you want to be asking yourself during the lag isn't, has my reality changed yet? Because that's as if you're asking every 10 minutes, are we there yet? And that question just keeps you focused on the output, which is exactly the wrong place to look during this phase. The real question is, have I changed? Because in any endeavor where you aim to be successful, whether that's in sports or business or whatever, at the end of the day, the biggest results come from you changing. The whole process, the whole journey is you changing as a person. And the shift in your external world is always a downstream consequence of the shift in you, right? And if you're genuinely holding a different internal state, if you're a different person in terms of your thoughts and your feelings, if you're running the inverted equation consistently, well, the external changes will follow. They just have to, because it's an equation. And that internal shift is the thing to measure yourself by during the lag period, because it's the only metric that is actually within your control and the only one that really predicts the outcome. So instead of actually checking your bank account every day, hoping to see a change, which is really just running the default equation again, check your thinking, check your internal state, your emotional state, check whether you're holding the new input, check whether your baseline has shifted. And if it has, you're on track regardless of what the external evidence says. So during the lag, you don't really have external proof yet. All you have is the internal shift and your understanding of the equation. And that has to be enough for a while, which is uncomfortable, but also kind of beautiful. It means that you're really building something from the inside out, which is the only way anything real can be built and anything lasting can be built. Because like we've been saying throughout this whole training, your current reality is just a printout of a previous internal state. So when the internal state changes, the printout has to change as well. There's no version of this where the input shifts and the output stays the same forever. The equation has to balance. And it will. Your only job is really to hold the new input steady until it does. That's it. So with that said, let's cover the review. We talked about the overview, the backwards equation, seeing the equation, flipping the variables, holding the inversion through the lag, the review, and finally your action items for the day or the next few days. First, start running the equation check today. Pause a few times throughout your day and ask yourself, am I reacting to my reality right now, or am I creating it? And then use that question as your anchor for building the awareness that makes the inversion possible. Then begin your morning calibration tomorrow, 5 minutes before you touch your phone, sitting with the emotional and cognitive signature of the version of you who already has what you want, thinking and feeling into that state fully, and then letting it set the tone for your entire day. Then finally, hold the thoughts and the feelings, right? When the old reality pushes back, and it will, just expect it, use the lag reframe to put it in context. Remind yourself that what you're seeing is just an old printout job finishing, and then just redirect your attention to your chosen thinking and internal state and trust that the new equation is already processing. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it brought a lot of value. If it did, make sure to like the video, comment below to let me know what you'd like to see next. Subscribe to the channel. If you want this document along with this training, make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. If you want to work with me one-on-one, then make sure to book a call, again, from the link in the description. And once again, if you want a weekly newsletter helping you improve in every aspect of your life, health, wealth, love, and self, then make sure to join the newsletter, again, from the link in the description. Once again, thank you for being here. Thank you for the support, and I'll see you in the next one.